Presentation of Idaho Reports on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore and Bettis family legacy of building the great state of Idaho. By the Friends of Idaho Public Television and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Idaho has 44 counties, and the county in which you die has a big impact on the investigation into your death or whether there's an investigation at all. I'm Melissa Davlin. Idaho Reports starts now. Hello and welcome to Idaho Reports. This week, Audrey Dutton of ProPublica and Casey Petty from the Office of Performance Evaluations joined me to discuss Idaho's coroner system, the lack of oversight, and how that can sometimes adversely affect families. Then Kevin Richert of Idaho Education News brings us up to date on school bonds and levies and more. But first, 4 women have sued the state of Idaho after they were forced to go out of state to terminate their wanted pregnancies. Idaho's abortion ban prohibited them from ending their pregnancies in the state, even if continuing the pregnancies threatened their health. That trial started on Tuesday. The trial, taking place in Idaho's 4th District, is the latest court challenge of Idaho's abortion ban. Producer Ruth Brown has more.
All 4 women reported that their babies had severe genetic or development issues that would have prevented the fetuses from surviving after birth. The women explained that the longer they stayed pregnant, the higher the risk was for their health. Attorneys are asking the court to declare Idaho's law unconstitutional for certain pregnant patients. That's those with pre-existing conditions that cannot be treated during pregnancy, pregnancies that endanger the mother's life, and pregnancies that have lethal fetal diagnoses. Idaho physicians testified about the medical and ethical concerns around not being able to help a patient when they need a medically necessary abortion.
These are real people who are stepping up to stop what happened to them from ever happening again. They are fighting to make sure that pregnant Idahoans can get the abortion care that they need to protect their health and their lives. They are an inspiration to me every day. Idaho state officials have tried to throw this case out twice now, turning a blind eye to the realities faced by their own citizens. But we refuse to let them get away with this. The state of Idaho must be held accountable for the suffering that they have caused.
The trial will continue next week, and the state will offer its defense.
Death eventually comes for all of us, but depending on where you die in Idaho, an investigation into your death might not follow. Casey Petty with the Office of Performance Evaluations and Audrey Dutton of ProPublica joined me on Friday to discuss Idaho's lack of oversight and sideboards on how Idaho's coroners run their offices. Thank you both so much for joining us this week. Casey, we'll start with you. What did lawmakers ask your office to look into?
So the way that our office works is we get requests from legislators to look into different programs and policies in the state. And a legislator raised concerns around the death investigation system in Idaho. So we've had some pretty high-profile deaths in Idaho over the last few years. And there was some stuff in the news that was concerning. And so this legislator was concerned that the way that death investigations were being conducted, county by county, varied. And that there were deaths in some counties that were being fully investigated, whereas in other counties, those deaths were not being investigated, and there were not autopsies. And so we were basically asked to look at how is Idaho's death investigation system working? What do other states do? What are some key metrics for death investigations? Like what are the funding for individual county coroners, and how many autopsies are coroners conducting?
For those who aren't familiar, Idaho, of course, has 44 counties.
Yeah.
That means 44 individually elected coroners, one for each county, but that doesn't mean 44 similar ways of doing things county by county.
Yeah, that's correct. So there's 44 coroners in Idaho because there's one for each county. And because Idaho Code is so vague on the duties and responsibilities of coroners, we found that there's wide variance in how they actually perform their duties. And so just to dial back really quick, so Idaho is not very unique in its design of the death investigation system. So there's 28 states that have coroners. There's 14 states that exclusively use county or district coroners, and then there's 14 states that use a combination of county coroners or county medical examiners. A medical examiner is similar to a coroner, except they're typically a medical professional that is appointed. And so in the design, it's not very unique. But what we found is in Idaho code, it's very vague on what the actual duties are for coroners. And so in a lot of other states, it's pretty well defined that, there's certain deaths that need to be autopsied. For example, a child death or maybe a death under law enforcement care. Those are typically autopsied in other states. In Idaho, it's up to the individual coroner themselves to decide whether or not an autopsy is performed. Idaho code is very vague on when deaths need to be reported to a coroner. And so there's national standards that kind of lay out, these are the deaths that should be reported to your medical legal death investigation system. It's things like, suicides, accidents, but also, individuals who die under police custody, individuals who die at work, things like that. We found that nationally, states usually in their state code have 15 different types of deaths that need to be reported to a coroner or the medical legal death investigation system. In Idaho, there's only 10. And it's missing a lot of the ones that are, very common in other states, like that individuals who die under police custody. And so because of how vague Idaho code is and how little direction it provides, how a coroner carries out their duties is up to the individual coroner, which creates a very diffused and fractured system.
And Audrey, you found real life examples rather, of how this is affecting Idahoans now, these differences in how coroners investigate or don't investigate deaths.
Right. So as part of our look at medical legal death investigations, we focused on children and infants, partly because the OPE report found Idaho has the lowest rate of autopsies in deaths of children that you'd typically expect to be overseen by a coroner. And in the process, I've looked through between 250 and 300 coroner reports and autopsy reports for child and infant deaths and found wide variation. There is very little consistency from county to county or from coroner to coroner within a county, partly because there aren't those sort of encoded standards for coroners in Idaho.
You found one example from Eastern Idaho that really stood out in your reporting.
That's right. It was the case of Onyx Cooley. He was a 2-month-old in Bingham County, where he was living with his mom. She woke up one morning and found him dead. And he was taken to a hospital in a neighboring county. In Bonneville County, that's right. And what I think is most interesting about this case is how it illustrates the lack of consistency from county to county, because when I looked at the report that the coroner in Bonneville County did, there was no scene investigation by the coroner. There was no reenactment of how the baby was found and left. There was no autopsy performed. The coroner did not contact the family at all. And when I looked at the Bingham County coroner's records, they did follow national standards. So it's sort of, if baby had been pronounced dead in the first county, it would have been completely different.
But because they took baby to the hospital, tried to resuscitate him in Idaho Falls, and he was declared dead in Bonneville County, there was no report, there was no investigation other than saying, what was it, a paperwork autopsy that the coroner said, where he just signed it off as SIDS.
That's right.
And that lines up with your findings, Casey, that wide variation and not necessarily following national standards and recommendations.
Yeah, and so, there's a lot that goes into the differences between counties. And I think one thing that is important to acknowledge is the difference in funding for counties, because autopsies are not cheap. And so most counties in Idaho use Ada County as their kind of de facto forensic pathologist. And so if you are in central, southern, east, or western Idaho, and someone dies for an autopsy, they're going to go to Ada County. Those autopsies cost about $2,300 each. And then if you are in eastern Idaho, you have to also factor in, the cost of transportation, because you may not have a vehicle to transport a decedent. And so that's several $100s as well. You might have to factor in the cost for a hotel, because it's a 2-day trip, because it's a 6-hour drive to Boise. And so all of that adds up. And so for an autopsy, you're looking at, anywhere from $3,000 to $4,000. A lot of these coroners, their budgets are $20,000 a year. And so decisions have to be made. And unfortunately, in conversations I had with coroners, they try to say that they don't take into account finances, but inevitably finances probably do come up.
You mentioned something that I want to circle back to. So I assume that regardless of where I die in the state, my body would be transported in an appropriate refrigerated vehicle to the place my body needs to go. You're saying that that's not necessarily the case if you die in certain parts of the state.
Yeah, unfortunately, not every county has an adequate vehicle to transport decedents. And so in conversations I had with coroners, I learned that some are using their private vehicles, maybe a truck with a cabin on the back. Some are using Suburbans, which is potentially dangerous because you're driving in an open air vehicle with a potentially decomposing body. Some counties do contract with a funeral home that might have a more appropriate vehicle, but again, you're looking at anywhere from $5,000 to $2,000 for that transportation. And so it really varies between the counties on whether or not they have an adequate vehicle. That extends to other things, such as coolers to store a decedent. There are some counties that have their own cooler that's secured, but most counties do not. And so they have to find a place to store a decedent before it can be transported for an autopsy. And that could be anywhere from a local hospital, or it could be a local funeral home. But then there's a lot of issues with that where it breaks the chain of custody over the body. And best practices typically say that you shouldn't be using an independent third party for transportation or for storage.
And Audrey, this has real effects on the surviving family members. Back to Onyx, and his mother and father are left wondering why he died.
Right, and they'll never get an answer because he's been cremated. The opportunity to investigate that death is gone, and it's a black box now. This has implications for, the kind of question of why does it matter? It not only matters to the parents, it matters to public health. If there was something potentially relating to Onyx or how he was, how he was sleeping or something like that, that could be learned from, this is how we figured out crib death wasn't a thing. It was put babies on their backs and make sure that they don't have stuffed animals in the crib and those sorts of things. That's a public health issue. But then there's also the question of, what about the other children? Is there some genetic problem that wasn't detected? So, looking at these not only from a case by case, but the public health and the overall family, and just figuring out what happened and not being left with questions.
Casey, we have about a minute left, but briefly, What are the recommendations for the legislature to address this?
So really quick, we recommended that the legislature adjust the way that funds are used that are collected from death certificates. So $1 for each death certificate right now can go towards coroner education. We recommended also allowing that to be used for coroner certification. And then we also recommended that the legislature look at these various gaps of Idaho code. So in our report, we have about 10 or 15 different areas that we felt that Idaho code is lacking, and we gave some examples of what other states are doing. And right now there is a group that some legislators are a part of, including Senator Wintrow and Representative Pickett, who are the JLOC co-chairs. And they're putting together legislation to hopefully create some definitions for terms that are vague right now in Idaho code, and also provide more state-level guidance for coroners.
All right, we'll be sure to keep following that story. Casey Petty, Office of Performance Evaluations, Audrey Dutton, ProPublica, thank you both so much for joining us, and we'll be sure to link your report and your excellent investigative reporting on our website. That's idahoreports.org. There were a couple significant headlines that came out of the November 5th election, gave us a few things to talk about, but I don't want to lose sight of the school bond and levy results that also came out that night. Here to bring us up to date is Kevin Richert from Idaho Education News. Kevin, real quick, remind us what was on the ballot.
So we had 24 supplemental levies around the state, and we had 4 plant facilities levies, which are a little bit different. They're basically for building maintenance. And we had 2 bond issues. Add it all up, there were $259 million worth of school ballot measures on the ballot on November 5th. Most of them passed. So $169 million worth of levies passed because neither of the bond issues passed. So by and large, school districts fared reasonably well on election night.
And for those who aren't familiar, who haven't watched these discussions before, remind us of the threshold for bond and levy passages.
Supplemental levies need only a simple majority to pass, which is why it probably shouldn't be surprising that 22 of the 25 supplemental levies passed on election night. Bond issues, very different. 2/3 supermajority required. That's difficult to get on any election day, especially maybe in a presidential election when you've got really high turnout.
Really high turnout across the state. Of the 169 that did pass with the levies, what are some highlights in there?
Biggest one of the bunch is Coeur d'Alene. They got a 2-year, $50 million supplemental levy through. These supplemental levies are a big deal for a lot of districts like Coeur d'Alene. I mean, I think it's about almost a quarter of their budget comes out of the supplemental levy. So you start talking about a levy, if a levy fails, these districts have really difficult decisions to face. And we're starting to see that unfold in the at least one of the districts that didn't get a levy through.
What was that district?
That's Lakeland. That's another district up north. They had a 2-year, $19 million, I want to say, supplemental levy. It failed. You ought to have patrons up there saying, bring something back in May, the next date that they can run a supplemental levy. Bring something back smaller and see what they can do, because they're talking about, it's almost inevitable, because this levy takes up about a quarter of their budget, or comprises about a quarter of their budget, that they'd almost have to look at some sort of staff reductions to absorb that loss.
What are some of the other ones that failed?
Now we'll talk about the bond issues, and the biggest one of the bunch was in Soda Springs. They were seeking about $55 million to replace an aging high school. That failed and didn't really come close to the 2/3 supermajority.
For those that failed, you had mentioned with Lakeland, you're looking at possible staff reductions. What are some of the other consequences for those districts?
It's interesting. I mean, for them, that's definitely a possibility of having to make some staff reductions. We've seen this happen elsewhere. One of the levies that passed in November was in Caldwell. Now, back in May, they had an identical levy that failed, required the district to go back and look at staff reductions, SROs, for example. They had to close the middle school. They also had to institute a pay-to-play fee for student athletes. So now they have a levy that passed, so that'll be in effect for the next budget year. So it'll be interesting to see what Caldwell winds up doing about some of the cuts that they had to make in the wake of the failed levy back in May.
And the elections aren't over. Whoever ends up in House and Senate leadership and with certain committee chairs is going to have a big say in the future of school policy over the next 2 legislative sessions, including potentially school funding issues.
School funding issues, school elections issues. One of the things that has come out that we wrote about in the past few days, school officials are talking about trying to get the state to look at maybe relaxing some of the rules on supplemental levies. Right now, schools have not many options. They can run a 1 or 2 year supplemental levy, or under certain circumstances, they can ask voters to approve a permanent supplemental levy. But those are, very rare circumstances where a district can even ask for that. Coeur d'Alene asked for that in 2023. Voters said no. So you have districts like Coeur d'Alene looking for maybe kind of a Goldilocks approach, where you can have something in the middle, maybe a supplemental levy that runs for up to 6 years. So you don't have this constant churn of going back to voters every year or two, and the uncertainty that creates for your budget.
And I noticed that in the coverage in the lead up to this election, that there were a number of levies that were basically re-upping ones that had been in place. And if anything, it would be a smaller hit on people's property tax bills than what they had previously passed before because of changing circumstances. But again, the districts folks have to go back to voters every 2 years over and over again and cross their fingers.
And all it takes is one failed supplemental levy to create some real budget problems for a district. Caldwell had a levy in place for a long time until May when voters said no. So, there's definitely appetite from the schools to have some sort of flexibility. Whether there's appetite in the legislature to do that, this is a legislature that has very clearly tried to pare down school elections and winnow down the options that schools have to put bonds and levies on the ballot in the first place.
And so many new faces in this upcoming legislature.
Yes, yeah, of course.
We also have some higher ed updates. Let's start with University of Phoenix. What's the latest?
We wanted to look back and see what exactly is happening on the University of Idaho, University of Phoenix deal. At this point, there isn't a whole lot of breakthrough going on. We do know that there are conversations going on. Everybody told me for the story that I did this week that U of I is talking, state board members are talking, governor's office is involved, talking with Phoenix, talking with Apollo, which is Phoenix's ownership group, talking also with legislators. And we remember last session, the legislature was pretty skeptical about this idea. And we know that this is going to come back before the legislature in January. So it's all kind of under the screen, under the radar right now. It's all kind of behind the scenes. It will become a lot more public again come January.
So as far as the what now, it's wait and see.
It's wait and see, and it's wait and see on a lot of stuff. One of the things that I got into in my story on Thursday, we still have a lawsuit pending before the state Supreme Court, Attorney General Raul Labrador's lawsuit that would basically might force the State Board of Education to start all over again in terms of its approval of this purchase. That is still pending, 5 months out from oral arguments. So we'll wait and see what happens there as well.
You also had a story this week about Idaho State University expressing interest in maybe buying or acquiring the Idaho College of Osteopathic Medicine, which is a private medical school in Meridian.
Another private college that may go into public ownership. This is a little bit different situation for a lot of reasons. First and foremost, ICOM, the Idaho College of Osteopathic Medicine, isn't for sale. It's not on the block right now. But everybody I spoke to indicated that it will be at some point. It's a little bit like Phoenix in the sense that, ICOM is partially owned by a private equity firm, and private equity firms tend to get to a point where they sell off assets. So, the president of ICOM told me this week, it's expected that at some point this will be for sale. What's interesting is that Idaho State is looking at the feasibility of acquiring this. I spoke to House Speaker Mike Moyle about it this week. He's interested. He wants to know more details. He says, he wants the state to be in a position should ICOM be for sale. Lots of connections right now, as it is between Idaho State University and ICOM. They basically share a campus in Meridian. They have been an affiliated relationship from the beginning. You have a board of trustees where the president of ISU is on the board of trustees, and other high-ranking Idaho State administrator is on the board. So there are a lot of connections between these two. And maybe the biggest connection is Idaho State has historically been the state's lead university on healthcare professions, healthcare majors. And Robert Wagner, the new president at Idaho State, has made pretty clear that he wants to assert that. He wants to continue to look for ways to partner with other institutions and to cement Idaho State's position in the healthcare professions. And
this, to me, is an intersection of so many interesting and important policy issues in Idaho right now. You have higher education, Idaho's Go On attempts and workforce readiness efforts like with Launch, the abortion ban and how that's contributed to the OBGYN shortage in the state, the ongoing existing healthcare worker shortage in the state.
A severe shortage of healthcare workers around the state and an aging population, and a growing population. So there are a lot of forces at play, which is part of why really all of the colleges and universities are very interested in trying to figure out ways to expand their healthcare footprint as well. So it's not just Idaho State that wants to expand its footprint. And it will be interesting to see how that all plays out because, there's already kind of indications that there's some competition right now for some of these healthcare, a share of this healthcare market, this healthcare professions market. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens from here.
launch is something else that plays into that. Future of it has been in question in previous legislative sessions, but it's popular with high school seniors.
Launch's future may be in doubt, but there really is no doubt about one of the things we're seeing with Launch. The most popular profession, the most popular in-demand career for Launch recipients this year, nursing.
Good for Idaho's aging population, who needs those nurses, I will say. Yeah. I did want to ask you about the lawsuit against the Mountain West Conference involving transgender athletes, and specifically San Jose State University player. Doesn't directly involve Idaho, except that there are 2 BSU volleyball players who are plaintiffs in the lawsuit,
yes.
and BSU is, of course, part of that conference.
And BSU has been central to this whole story that has unfolded this fall. You've had 4 universities, including Boise State, in the Mountain West Conference that have forfeited matches against San Jose State because of the reported transgender player on San Jose State's roster. So the lawsuit gives us a little bit more insight into what may have been happening behind the scenes with Boise State leading up to that first forfeit. It sounds like players were involved to some degree in the conversation that led up to the administration deciding to forfeit that first match. They have since forfeited a second match involving San Jose State. Yeah, and this is an issue that we've seen discussed and debated at the state level for several years. We have a transgender athletics law that's been that was passed, I believe, in 2020. So, this has been an issue for several years. This volleyball dispute has really brought it to a national plane. I mean, this has become a national sports story and one that is far from over at this point because the lawsuit was just filed on Wednesday. It's leading up to the Mountain West Conference's volleyball tournament, which is the end of November. A lot's happening on this story.
No, and I read the initial filing, the lawsuit yesterday. Multiple claims in there, including violations of students' First Amendment free speech rights and 14th Amendment equal protection rights specifically, as well as Title IX, which guarantees women equal opportunities in athletics.
And really, from a Boise State perspective, what I focused on in my story was the allegation that the Mountain West changed its policy regarding transgender athletics and potentially forcing schools to forfeit matches or games involving an opponent with a transgender athlete. The lawsuit contends that that policy was changed the same day that Boise State announced its first forfeit. That's in dispute. Mountain West has said that they've had this policy in place for some time, at least for a couple of years. That's going to play out in the court.
Sure, and there's a difference. Did they have the policy in place, but then did they then tweak it?
Exactly. Yeah. That's going to be a bone of contention in this lawsuit.
Yeah, and one of the things that I'll be keeping an eye on is whether or not people can speak about this in nuanced ways as opposed to inflammatory ways against all of the athletes and parties involved.
It's one of the most emotional issues in athletics and in education right now. And, Boise State and the Mountain West Conference are at the heart of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Kevin Richert, we have about 30 seconds left. As we are leading up to those leadership races that we discussed earlier, what are you going to be keeping an eye on? House
education, first and foremost, because we will have a change in House Ed. It'll be interesting to see where leadership goes. Do they go with a more moderate chair, kind of like they had with Julia Yamamoto before she was voted out in the primary? Do they go for a more conservative chair? That's a committee that's going to be very interesting to watch for a lot of these issues that we've been talking about.
All right. You can read all of Kevin's excellent reporting at idahoednews.org. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for watching. You can find all of our supplemental coverage at idahoreports.org, and we'll be back next week.
Presentation of Idaho Reports on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore and Bettis family legacy of building the great state of Idaho, by the Friends of Idaho Public Television, and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.